Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today we're going to talk about nuclear weapons, and not just any nuclear weapons, but some brand new planned nuclear weapons that the Brits are planning. So, as you know, there are several countries in the world that retain their nuclear weapons, and some people seem to want more of them. And that seems to be what's going on in the United Kingdom now, a plan to acquire new nuclear weapons. So we have three people here who know a lot about this topic and who are concerned about it, as we all ought to be. In England, Nick Ritchie is a professor at the University of York, and Rebecca Johnson is in London at the Acronym Institute, which she heads and has been working on this issue for many, many years. And on the other side of my continent, Paul Meyer is in Vancouver. I guess you are in Vancouver, British Columbia. So we are going to span the globe today. Nick Ritchie, would you please explain to us what is going on in your country and why we should worry about it?
Okay, many thanks, Meta, and it's nice to be with you to participate in this conversation. So it might be useful for your listeners if I just give a bit of context to this change in policy. So coming out of the Cold War period, so going back now to the early 1990s, the direction of travel for UK nuclear weapons policy was slow motion reductions. And through the first decade of the post-Cold War period, we saw the UK stockpile reduce and reduce down to the single nuclear weapon system that we currently have, which is the Trident nuclear weapon system, which consists of four ballistic missile submarines armed with American designed and built Trident missiles that we lease from them, and then a stockpile of UK designed and built nuclear warheads that are very closely based on an American version of a warhead that the Americans deploy on their own Trident missiles on their own submarines. So that's where we were at the end of the 1990s, and steadily the two political parties that were in power in the UK in the 90s, the Conservatives, followed by Tony Blair's New Labour, successively reduced in a kind of salami slicing way the number of missiles that were going to be deployed on the submarine at sea and the number of warheads that were going to be deployed on the submarine at sea, and then the overall stockpile of the UK's nuclear warheads. And we were coming down and down and down. That continued through the 2000s until we get to a major defence review conducted by the Conservative and Liberal Democrat coalition government in 2010. And that review said we're going to reduce further, and we have this target of reducing the overall nuclear warhead stockpile from 225 down to the target by the mid-2020s, so kind of where we're getting to now. The target was to get down to 180, and that will be the overall stockpile, and to reduce the number of operationally deployed warheads, or operationally available, I should say, warheads, to about 120. And everyone thought, well, that process is continuing. Those commitments were restated in another big defence review in 2015. And up until about a year and a half ago, government ministers were repeating this. This is still the plan. And then we get to this integrated, wow, this is a long title. It's an integrated security, defence, foreign policy and development review, which has been in the works for about 2 years and was kind of interrupted and influenced by Brexit and then the pandemic. So this came out last week, and to everyone's surprise, we find out that these targets and this trajectory of slowly consolidating the size of the nuclear warhead stockpile, that's been scrapped now, and it wasn't even a question of kind of we haven't reached that target of 180 of the total stockpile yet, and we're not going to, but we're going to stay where we are, whatever that might be. It might have been 195, it might have been 200, whatever. The government said we're going to lift that cap. So the government uses this phrase, a cap on the warhead stockpile. And part of that reason is because The government never says directly, this is the number of warheads that we have. They always, the language uses, our stockpile will be no more than 225 back in 2010, working down to no more than 180. So now in the integrated review, they said, well, that cap is going to be lifted to no more than 260, which is quite an uptick from where we were. So the trajectory was coming down bit by bit through the 1990s, through the 2000s, through the 2010s, with the aim of getting to a maximum of 180 total nuclear warheads in the UK arsenal by the mid-2020s. So
Can I ask what that means? Because when they say it's going to be no more than that, does that say explicitly we were down lower and we're going to actually increase the number we have? Or does it mean that we've really had that many all along and we're just not going to get rid of them?
It's a bit of both, I think. But the government will be ambiguous about this. It won't give you an answer to that question.
Why?
Because, well, the language used is that if we give specific detail, it's going to aid our adversaries' nuclear planning. That's the phrasing, the national secrecy phrasing behind which details can be hidden. And in fact, in this review, the government has increased opacity over even the few details that it's prepared to reveal publicly in the interests of democratic accountability. So it's, in fact, the government has said, whereas previously it would say what the upper limits were on the stockpile and the upper limits on operationally available warheads, the upper limits on the number of warheads that would be deployed on the submarine at sea, all those sorts of figures, which kind of give you some parameters to see where the UK nuclear arsenal is at. This integrated review says, no, we're not going to tell you any of that anymore. Your question about whether this is kind of building up from up to 260 or kind of just stopping where they were, we don't know that. We don't know how far down on this trajectory towards 180 by the mid-2020s. We don't know exactly how far along the Ministry of Defence had got, but they were coming down from 225. So to then increase up to 260 suggests they're not going to stop where they are, that there are plans, either immediately or looking over the next decade, which is the planning horizon for this integrated review. That it implies there are plans to increase the number of warheads that we have operationally available beyond where we were in 2010, getting back perhaps to where we were in the mid-1990s.
One of my other hats is as a co-coordinator of all the partners of ICANN in the UK. And once this integrated review got published, we held an emergency meeting last week to discuss it. And this goes to your question, actually, Meta, because there was a bit of a discussion, a bit of a disagreement, in fact, in some ways, between those who were wanting to be sending out the messaging that this was a reversal of position, or that it was somehow a position that was a U-turn away from the NPT and non-proliferation and disarmament and so on. And others who were saying, well, actually, if you take into account that in the period between 2006 and 2016, when the final decision, well, we hope it's not the final decision, but the decision was taken to actually start, as they say, cutting the steel on the new submarines for replacing the Trident nuclear weapons system, that the UK earmarked already £43 billion to do that, saying that was really just for the submarines.
Sorry, I'm unclear about what was being cut. Okay. Was this an actual reduction of something on existing nuclear submarines, or is this a non-expansion plan?
Let me be a bit clearer about that. And perhaps I should actually backtrack and explain just very quickly that the current UK nuclear system is based on 4 Vanguard class, they're called submarines. They're armed with US Trident missiles, and they're based in Scotland at 2 bases, Faslane and Coulport, up in Scotland. And the nuclear bomb factories that make and also refurbish the nuclear warheads for fitting onto the US missiles, and this is the nuclear weapon system for the UK. The nuclear bomb factories are Aldermaston and Burfield, and they are based just west of London. So that's the current system. In 2006 to 2007, the Labour government under Tony Blair initiated a debate and a discussion about replacing and renewing. And that chunted on for quite some time until soon after, in fact, within about a month of the Brexit decision, the Prime Minister, in one of her first acts, Theresa May, the Prime Minister who came in when David Cameron just left, having messed things up. Theresa May, one of her first steps was to hold the parliamentary debate that then took the decision to earmark the money which they had identified as essentially £43 billion for the submarines to be built. This and this they tried to say this settled the debate. Of course it didn't, but let's now move forward. The first of these submarines are being built in Barrow, a shipbuilder, their BAE Systems, but they're not due to be ready until the 2030s. Now, the 43 billion that was earmarked then by the government, in fact, already a senior Tory who was the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Crispin Blunt, put the figure at nearly nearly 200 billion pounds, which was actually very close to the 205 billion price tag that CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament here in the UK, had identified the actual replacement of Trident was going to cost the British people. So now I'm going to move rather fast forward. So when we heard about the integrated review, some were arguing that it was not so much a new development or a U-turn as making more explicit the options that the UK government always had on the table, making, in a sense, unmasking UK policies. But I think there are the 2 crucial differences. One is the crucial point, the point that Nick made, which is it has explicitly said we're going to reserve to ourselves the right to go up to at least 260 warheads into the stockpile. And the second thing, and I think that this sometimes gets missed, but I think it's extremely important, they were making a commitment still that they would always have a nuclear-armed submarine at sea at all times. And that this is called the continuous at-sea deterrence policy. Mm-hmm. And they also, and this is really important, they not only reduce the transparency and really increase the notion that ambiguity is essential for the nuclear weapons, but they, and I just want to get this right too, they basically changed, while saying that they were going to remain the same, on the negative security assurances, the security assurances that UK has always given under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which have changed over time, that essentially said that as well as saying that we would use nuclear weapons only in the extreme circumstances of the very survival of our country, and saying, really relating it to WMD threats, This time, what they've said is that we reserve the right to review the assurance, not only if the future threat of weapons of mass destruction, such as chemical and biological weapons, capabilities are perceived as a sufficient threat, but emerging technologies, this is the quote, that could have a comparable impact.
Mm.
And so we're expanding into that. And I think we need to think about what the implications of that really are or could be. So the number of statements have come out that are arguing that this does undermine the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The UN Secretary General, Ambassador Antonio Guterres, said as much. So did a UK, a very senior military Major General, Jonathan Shaw, asked the question, which we were all asking: how is raising our strategic warhead cap relevant to a potential rise in the thought short or medium range nuclear threat? He then said this move was inappropriate and disproportionate. So I think this is a question that we really need to discuss, is just what have nuclear weapons at all got to do with real security? And certainly, what on earth is going on when the UK Prime Minister seems to feel he has to wrap at least a perception of expanding the commitment to nuclear weapons into the Union Jack flag? What has this got to do with our real security? And even if you thought it had something to do with it, what really is the difference between the current plans of extending the Trident system into the 2050s, 2060s, that obviously we're working very hard not to have happen, but is current policy? Why increase, and why do it now? And I think that's a question to be raised.
Yeah, so I might jump in here now. Whatever the sort of rationale within Whitehall, I think we have to acknowledge that the optics on this move are just terrible. And there is, outside of the UK, I think, a real sense of betrayal in terms of this shift, because of all the 5 nuclear weapon states recognized under the NPT, the UK in many ways seemed to be the most progressive, the one that was most committed to transparency in terms of its deployed and stockpile of weapons, its reduction to one system, its more apparent support for further moves on nuclear disarmament. And suddenly, to turn on a dime, it seemed, in direct contravention of assurances provided by Minister of State of the Foreign Office at the last NPT review conference, that this reduction down to 180 was to be achieved in the 2020s, to in fact have authorized a 44% increase in the potential nuclear arsenal. So this sends the worst of all possible messages to the NPT, which is frankly in a pretty fragile situation at the moment. Anyways, its last review conference in 2015 failed to come up with a consensus outcome. It was to have its 50th anniversary review conference in the spring of 2020. COVID-19 intervened, and now that review conference is slated for August. But at this time, when there is already great pressure on the continued viability of the NPT to have a nuclear weapon state, in a sense, reverse itself and suggest that we need more weapons rather than fewer, obviously just adds to the existing skepticism by the 185 non-nuclear weapon states parties to that treaty that there's any sincerity at all or intention by the nuclear weapon states to honor their Article 6 commitment to move towards nuclear disarmament. So it's a very counterproductive move at this time. Here in Canada, the Canadian Network to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, an umbrella group of 18 non-governmental organizations that promote peace and security, have just issued a press release highly critical of this move. They've called upon the Canadian government to intervene with their ally, the UK, and have in that release, I should note that it also quotes from remarks the German foreign minister has made, basically saying, as long as you hang on to these weapons, others are going to want to have them. And this move in the contrary direction undercuts the possibilities for cooperation and agreement and a successful result out of that NPT review conference. So it is a very disturbing development for strategic stability and for the continued sort of authority of the nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament regime in light of this British action.
Could I just add a bit of further context to that? Because, Paul, you've captured the international response to this move by the UK and how that quite obviously contradicts a self-characterization from our diplomats over the last 20 to 30 years of the UK as the most responsible of the NPT 5 nuclear weapon states, the most forward-leaning on nuclear disarmament, and so on. And, it could tell that story, with a reasonable degree of sincerity, as long as it was on this slow motion downward trajectory with its nuclear arsenal and so on. Okay, with a pinch of salt, we can accept that. Now that's been thoroughly contradicted by this move, I think. And I don't know if Boris Johnson, the advisors around him, Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, are aware of this, and even if they are, then perhaps whether they even care. But you've got that contradiction there. But the broader context here is the post-Brexit framing by the Tory Brexit ideologues of their imagining of Britain in the world after Brexit. You have this narrative of global Britain that gained traction and was articulated under Theresa May, and now in particular under Boris Johnson, that frames a post-Brexit Britain in terms of kind of being freed from these bureaucratic shackles of the EU, now free to stride the world again. Lots of rule Britannia coming back out in terms of discourse from Tory MPs in Parliament. But part of this is quite a national. They frame it with the slogan "Global Britain," and there's lots of talk of sort of the need for cooperation, multilateralism, and diplomacy in the integrated review. But at its heart, it's a very nationalistic perspective, very bombastic, that frames this global Britain idea and Britain being a global power with global reach in quite militaristic ways, and the capacity to sustain and deploy the Trident nuclear weapon system that gives the UK kind of global nuclear reach and underpins its pretensions to global military power is part and parcel of that. So on the one hand, you've got real disappointment that the UK has reversed this kind of trajectory it was on, and is kind of reclaiming the necessity and legitimacy of nuclear weapons, and kind of saying, we've got nuclear weapons and we should be proud of them. I mean, you've got this kind of percolating through through in the narrative in the UK as well. And that needs to be understood within this broader post-Brexit global Britain narrative, which has come through in this integrated review, and is built on, you know, these kind of pretensions to global military power. I mean, what you've essentially got with the UK armed forces now are these two big, expensive, symbolic military weapon systems: the Trident system and the various forces, other bits of military kit that need to go into protecting those submarines at sea, and then the aircraft carriers, the carrier battle groups, which are big, expensive things. And that's kind of it. That's what the UK military has almost been reduced to. But the symbolic significance of those within this post-Brexit narrative can't be underestimated too. Sorry, Rebecca.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And at the same time, they have really outraged the defense services by basically saying that they're going to cut the troops, the people on the ground who are being sent abroad to do various tasks. And it's a funny mishmash, this, because it has a lot of, the whole integrated review has a lot of stuff in it about soft power, and actually a recognition that we have a lot of different kinds of tools for to use the soft power tools, and a range of different roles for defense services that could be used. So it's dressed up in that kind of clothing, and then you get to the nuclear weapons, and it's headed the nuclear deterrent, which starts off the UK's independent nuclear deterrent, which of course the Brits have been doing for a long time. They can't really bear to acknowledge that we have nuclear weapons. This predates Boris. It goes back also to Labour governments, where we have a deterrent, and we're worried about the nuclear weapons of, Russia or China or Iran that actually doesn't have them, although we have reason to be worried that they might get them, because they are part of a system that where those who have nuclear weapons are carrying on with them, and are carrying on, increasing and redesigning and enhancing the nuclear weapons. And this is a context that has to be taken into account. But the other thing that struck me, if I can just quickly add to this, that really adding on to what Nick said, was that as well as the whole jingoism, when you read it, it's very long on rhetoric. It's very short of reality. It's got no real strategy. And if you look beyond the rhetoric of, for example, putting climate and biodiversity as number one priorities, and obviously COVID and so on, when you actually look at their budgeting, then you see a very different picture. And so the budgets are still, as Nick said, they're going into the high ticket kind of really the white elephants that signal great power, but actually make us look like we've got, and to use that British phrase, I don't know if you have something similar in Canada, all mouth and no trousers, which I think
they call it in Texas, they say all hat and no cattle.
Okay. If I could ask Rebecca and Nick for one thing that struck me. I mean, the review maintains this sort of commitment to a minimum nuclear deterrent, and yet we are seeing how kind of flexible that understanding of minimum is. But what conceivable justification is given from a security perspective for this increase in the stockpile? I mean, I understand the defense secretary had said something about improved ABM system around Moscow, or is it that they've identified new hamlets in North Korea that they're going to have to target? What rationale is there?
In terms of what has been said to justify this, nothing. I mean, you're rightful that on the Sunday morning talk show on the BBC, hosted by the political journalist Andrew Marr, Ben Wallace, the Defense Secretary, sort of muttered things about Russian ballistic missile defenses and other novel nuclear weapon systems that Russia is deploying. That's about it. There's subsequently been some questions in Parliament, including from some Tories, wanting to know what's the justification here. The Department of the Defense Department here issued a couple of 4 or 5 days after the big integrated review, issued a separate defense paper that was kind of building out on some of this, but there's nothing more in there. And Ben Wallace has subsequently said in Parliament, they're going to see if they can explain the reasoning behind this a bit more. And I think you can go two ways on this. You can either follow kind of the culture and practice of nuclear deterrence thought in the UK from kind of the 70s onwards, continuing into the post-Cold War period, that says that the main nuclear threat we have is Russia, and Russia looms very large as the big threat in the integrated review. Russia remains the main nuclear threat. Historically, UK nuclear targeting was based on this phrase that came out in the 80s of targeting then Soviet centers of power in Moscow. So it's been the assumption that UK nuclear targeting has been based on holding at risk kind of political and military centers of power and command and control in Moscow. It's not about targeting Russia's nuclear forces. We don't have enough to do that in the way that the Russians and the Americans had and have nuclear targeting plans to attack each other's nuclear weapons. That's not the line, that's not the path that the UK has taken. So that implies then, if you accept that reasoning and that history, that really the only reason to justify is on a case that sort of the ability or the assuredness with which our nuclear planners think that they can destroy these set of targets they deem essential to hold at risk has changed somehow through hardening of these targets or better missile defenses now or projecting into the future. And therefore we need more warheads because we're going to need to have more on the submarine that's on patrol all the time in the Atlantic. So you kind of maybe that's it, but we don't know.
I'm hearing, as you say, that there is no real strategic rationale for this. It's all baloney. That really what seems to be influential here is this is a way of swaggering. This is a symbolic gesture of showing how independent and wonderful old-fashioned Britain is nowadays. Yeah. And so, okay, if I want to ask whether, you really think one is the real explanation and the other one is negligible, or whether there's some sort of secret thinking going on that isn't clear about the strategic rationale for it. But then if it is a question of swaggering, did you see this coming? Because if you've tied it in a way to Brexit, yes, now that Britain is going to be independent, we can show how big we are. And if that's the case, was that in the rhetoric before Brexit or in leading up to Brexit? Are you surprised by this? Did these pro-Brexit people talk this way all along and I just hadn't heard it? Or is this a new development in the rhetoric, the political rhetoric in Britain?
Can I come onto that? I think that's a great question, Meta. Brexit really was, again, it was using a lot of advertising slogans, not taking account really of consequences at all. And that's how Boris, played an absolutely significant part in winning that vote. But nuclear weapons really barely came up in it. I wrote some pieces arguing the importance of the EU as collective security, and that had far more to, that keeping the peace in Europe over these past decades since the Second World War had far more to do with the building up of the the European Union with its very different kind of common foreign and security policies and using soft power and all of those kinds of ways of looking at, than either Britain's nuclear weapons, France's nuclear weapons, or NATO. So, but we were often the ones sort of trying to point some of these things out. So I don't think that it wasn't part of that debate then, but I think we have come. I think I was not completely surprised that something was pulled out of the hat on nuclear weapons that was wrapped in the flag, and for two reasons really. One is that swaggering is really the right term to be using. That previous leaders have swaggered with nuclear weapons, going right back, actually, many decades. And Boris is a swaggerer par excellence. And nuclear weapons meet his criteria. It's a very simple thing to kind of wave, and everybody thinks we're big, we're great, and we can destroy the entire world, except they don't think the latter part of that. And so here's the other thing that I think needs to be thought about with this, because what I've also seen is that because there has been actually quite a lot of news that has been posing that very question, is what on earth is the strategic need to do this? And as Nick said, there isn't one. Then people start saying, so why are we doing it? Because it's going to cost money. Our economy is shattered both by COVID and by Brexit. It's going to take a long time to rebuild both of those. So all of our security architecture that we've relied on, both in national terms and in regional terms particularly, are having to be remade in a situation where we have less power, less room to move, less economic clout. And on top of that, Scotland, which UK nuclear weapons utterly depend on the two bases in Scotland. There could be one other harbour that's in Wales where the submarines might be able to be used, possibly one in England, but there is no other place that has the right kind of geology, and there's no other place to store the warheads. End of. And there's Scotland, since Brexit, really tried to pull away more and more, because what they want now, or what an increasing majority of Scots people want, is to become independent of this, broken UK union, and rejoin, or be seen, rejoin the EU. I mean, that's really what they want. They see themselves, along with Ireland, as being able to make a go of it as a smaller country that has a lot to contribute in other kinds of ways. So, and there's a Scottish election coming up, by the way, in May. So these come into it. So something that we should be discussing is that another of the implications of this integrated review, and particularly of this upping of the ante on the nuclear weapons, is that more people than before have actually been talking about, why does Britain need nuclear weapons at all? Don't they endanger us more? There's now this UN treaty. It's a multilateral treaty. It actually bans all aspects of nuclear weapons. It creates the basic principles to be able to build up how to eliminate nuclear weapons safely and securely. And wouldn't it be better for Britain to take the lead? We've got lots of technological expertise and in verification, and a nuclear disarmament verification project that actually has very little money, but has actually made some very interesting, taken some interesting steps. Surely there's more jobs now in getting rid of the nuclear weapons and building up other forms of non-nuclear deterrence, and the soft power that we say we have, but actually we have a very declining part of, and this would be a better use of money and resources. So these things are kind of juxtaposing at the very point at which the UK suddenly becomes almost a rogue state in terms of undermining the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was one of its major arguments for opposing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Others are saying, and the cities are lining up. I was just doing a meeting with Mayors for Peace. The cities in the UK are lining up to adopt motions that will support and align themselves with the TPNW. So these are countervailing. They're interesting. Sometimes when you get a shock of this sort, but we also shouldn't underestimate Boris's ability that when he sees that a policy is not very popular, of doing a U-turn. So the kind of pressure that's coming up is opening doors also to raise questions about existing UK policy that have been difficult to do since that vote in 2016. Both on financial and on strategic and and grounds of real sort of human security and human security ways of doing deterrence, these sorts of things, but also has raised the spectre of Boris Johnson being the person that gets to push the button. We shouldn't underestimate real concerns about kind of, how much can he be trusted not to get it wrong?
I want to go back, if you will, to this issue about Scotland, because that was the thing that surprised me most. Maybe I have a completely wrong impression here in North America, but I had the idea that, okay, Scotland may just leave the UK, and where would you guys be? Where would you put your submarines? People must realize that there's no place to go, and in that case, you're already on thin ice. You're already in a very risky situation. Why would you compound that difficulty by saying you want even more of the same problem? Am I imagining this, or is it a wrong perception of the way things are? Is there really no real risk that Scotland will leave, or are people ignoring I don't understand why people aren't feeling extremely anxious about that as a possible outcome and as a problem that you have to face.
Scottish partners of ICANN, of which there are many, and they also engage on things like Don't Bank on the Bomb, as well as cities appeals and things. They are actually see this possibility as an argument that feeds into their efforts to get both Scottish independence and, through Scottish independence, make it impossible for the UK to carry on with nuclear weapons. And I think that and this election is going to be fairly crucial in May, to see if the Scottish National Party, together with the Greens, can get the kind of majority to call for another referendum. They would have to have, at least according to current situation, another referendum to do that. But after Brexit, the pressure for another referendum, because the context in which there was the narrow vote against Scottish independence 2 years before Brexit, that everything changed. And so, we have to see that these are now very much linked in people's minds. And I think, and I don't know how Nick sees this, but I think that together with, as part of the integrated review, what I think Boris is also trying to line up is greater kind of commitments that he hopes to be selling as jobs for Scotland, as well as perhaps money for Scotland, are kind of sprinkled through the integrated review in other ways. In one particular issue that Paul would be very interested in, there's a whole section on an integrated space policy, making the UK a meaningful player in space. Since we've left the EU, we obviously can't use the EU facilities for rocket launching, but the UK has a lot of expertise in the satellites that have been launched using EU facilities. So here we are, that there's going to be, the integrated review says, a commercial launch capability for the UK, launching British satellites from Scotland. And there are these kinds of things where, but to leave on this issue, Meta, I think we honestly don't know if there will be a big enough vote for the parties that want independence in May. We'll be able to judge much better then. But that is definitely the direction of travel. And this is something that Boris doesn't want to preside over, the breakup of the union, but he may indeed do that, just in the same way that David Cameron didn't want to be presiding over the UK leaving Europe. But in his foolishness and hubris, that's exactly what he did. And Boris is both foolish and has a great deal of hubris, as well as being, like David Cameron, somebody that gets tactics, particularly political tactics, to wrong foot his political adversaries. But there isn't a shred of strategy in him. And you see that in the so-called integrated review.
Particularly the Tory governments in London are basically making a 50-year bet that Scotland, this is in terms of what would happen to the UK nuclear weapon system. Where would it go in the event of Scottish independence? They've placed a 50-year bet that Scotland will not vote for independence, because we're in the process now of building a replacement for the current Trident system, starting with these 4 massively expensive new submarines, and new warheads will come later, and so on and so forth. But a massive amount of investment in these new submarines that are going to be based at Scotland. Now, the first of those is going to be deployed in the early 2030s, and they're going to be designed with around about a 40-year service life. So that's taking you out to 2070. And you know, there's nowhere else for these things to go, as Rebecca said, particularly the warheads. So the government is placing a bet that from now until about 2070, Scotland is going to be part of the Union, and there won't be any issues around continuing to use the bases at Fastlane and Coulport. And you know what? I wouldn't bet on that. I wouldn't bet on the next 10 years, let alone the next half a century. The direction of travel in Scottish politics, in terms of the political fortunes of the Scottish National Party, have been in favour of the SNP from about the early 90s onwards. And a stick in there. The Labour vote has collapsed. What was previously a very strong Labour vote has collapsed, and the Tories remain toxic as a political force in Scotland, and we don't see that changing anytime soon. But the two things that combine this, I think, in terms of this kind of Tory post-Brexit politics, is you get this phrasing, which isn't particular to this government. It goes back to Labour in the 90s, this framing of Britain in world politics as a force for good, and the UK being kind of a military force for good. And you get that in the international context, but also in the context of kind of union politics. This idea that the union is an unequivocal, intrinsic kind of force for good for all the countries that are in the union. But the problem with that is that there are, you know, quite a few countries in the world that we think might like the UK that kind of don't see us as this shining knight in armour. And there are plenty in Scotland that don't buy the argument that the union is a force for good for everybody in that union. But you get this kind of this rhetoric in Westminster where it seems to be internalized as a political truth that the UK just is a force for good.
Well, then, Nick, can you give me an idea of whether or not there's any prospect that people who think the way you do and who think this is an extremely risky bet they're making, that what could be done to stop what's on the way? What is the prospect of defeating the whole plan?
It has to be done by civil society. I think the publication of the Integrated Review, a lot of us, both members of or partners with ICANN and a lot of other think tanks and Rethink Security, groups that are trying to think of security in very different kind of framings, put in our views as part of the Integrated Review kind of consultation process. And what came out really didn't take any of that into account. It very much was, it felt almost personally Boris's, in a way that some of the previous strategic reviews by previous governments were much more kind of measured. This was very much about, Great Britain, global Britain, and this notion, which always nauseates me, but punching above our weight. So I think we have to recognize, those of us that don't live in Scotland have to recognize we can carry on having those dialogues. And I'm in the process of, I hope, finalizing a report on the UK and TPNW. Of course, now I have to take this integrated review into account in a chapter I thought I'd finished on UK policy. And also update the Scottish section. But really, it's going to be civil society as a whole, altogether, but particularly we are working so closely with Scottish civil society because we do basically recognize that in terms of strategy, the best chance we have to have the UK become a state party to the TPNW is for Scotland to become independence. I think that's the reality on the ground. And therefore, we're putting quite a lot of resources into to really supporting that and making sure that the voters know, because the Scottish voters also really don't like nuclear weapons. They've always been the part of the UK that has been least committed, least beguiled by the notion of nuclear weapons wrapped in the Union Jack. And it's a declining number of jobs associated with that, and that's actually not really going to change. And they can see better uses for both the, Great Lochside location of Faslane. If they took the nuclear weapons away, they're thinking about how they would increase jobs there, and also looking at Coulport, so for them, it's a win-win to get rid of the nuclear weapons.
Coulport? What is Coulport? Sorry, what is Coulport?
Coulport is the nuclear warhead storage facility. It's very close to Faslane, both of them about 35 miles northwest of Glasgow. And Coulport is built right into the rock, which makes it geologically a slightly better option if you're going to store a bunch of nuclear warheads. And if there is an accident there's one village directly across the loch that would be destroyed. But then it goes out into the Atlantic, and guess who's the other end of the Atlantic if there's an accident from Coulport? I think you'll find that it's the Canadian coast.
I wonder if I could introduce, just another thought about the review being a missed opportunity, because as Rebecca just alluded to, there are some important new directions in terms of cyber and space, recognizing that these, in a sense, are the new power vectors and should require a greater investment. But surely that would have been the time to jettison the old-fashioned symbols of power in the nuclear weapons, and to free up the resources to pursue these more contemporary capacities for the projection of force. So it, in that way, failed, I think, an important opportunity to readjust in a more rational basis. But I appreciate Nick or Rebecca's views on that.
Yeah, they do have quite a lot on cyber, and as I said, Space Command and so on. They do recognize all of these things, whether they actually have the money to resource them, as they say. But you're quite right that having recognized all of this and having got quite a good bit of analysis in there about the diversity of the needs for security, they then don't jettison the highly expensive white elephant in the room of nuclear weapons. They don't take that opportunity. You're quite right.
Yeah, I mean, it's going back to the previous part of the conversation, Meta, where you asked, what do we do about this? And Rebecca, you were talking about civil society. I mean, one thing we can do is continue to point out the contradictions between the overarching framing of world politics and threats and challenges, and how nuclear weapons make sense within that, because there are glaring contradictions, and we've seen this in past defence reviews in the UK as well. But we are stuck with a mantra that's become dogma, that nuclear weapons are the ultimate insurance policy for the protection, defence of the United Kingdom, the ultimate insurance policy. And it's something that's trotted out by Blair, Cameron, May, now Johnson. It's just embedded as a phrase that's become a dogma, insofar as there's lots packaged in within that says, or that equates UK nuclear weapons, the Trident system, with protection and safety of the realm. And you want protection and safety of the realm, right? Therefore, you need Trident. And you're questioning why the UK retains nuclear weapons? Well, that means you're not supporting protection and safety of the realm. And they're kind of locked like this. And you see this time and time again in debates in the House of Commons, and engagement with the Ministry of Defence, and so on and so forth. And that needs kind of separating. You see it in another sense in terms of the difficulties that the Labour Party has, whereby the Tories quite deliberately sort of conflate together support for Trident and the British ability to inflict horrible, horrific nuclear violence on other countries with broader support for our armed forces, so that it becomes very difficult for Labour and others that oppose Britain's nuclear weapons to say, we're against nuclear weapons, but we're supportive of these aspects of our armed forces, because the Tories and the right-wing press will hammer you and say, if you're not in support of Trident, then you're not supporting our armed forces. And that's really difficult, but that's where the politics of this is at. But you do have this real issue whereby you see in this defence review, as with previous ones, an understanding that the world is messy, deeply interdependent, deeply integrated. We are all on this in facing the same set of global challenges around climate, the climate disaster that we're facing, on food, on disease, on poverty, on inequality, that we're going to have to work together on. And at the same time, you're framing these big important states like China and Russia that we need to work with as people that, in order to survive, seemingly, we need to have this ability to threaten them with nuclear annihilation.
Nick, that's you've given the final pep talk. Exactly what we need is exactly that point to be made as we wind up our conversation, that we're all on the same planet, and we are definitely our interdependence is increasing, if anything. So,
Meta, can I just add, because you said it would be possible just to have, because I just want to also call on Paul and people like him and recognize that it's precisely, people in the UK, allied countries, who can have some also real influence. But Boris Johnson does do U-turns when he thinks that he's become unpopular with it. And I think it's really important for Paul, please keep up your editorials. I think they're great. We could do with some more of those from, all of the allies across, across Europe and beyond, really pointing out that the UK, if it takes this forward, is undermining its existing legal obligations.
I'm so grateful to both, and to Paul, everybody, for this conversation. I hope people listen and take heart from the challenges that we are all facing. Thank you all
very much
for organizing this and inviting us. This is great to have this.